Today we're going to be talking about infidelity and betrayal and what we wish we would have known as general therapists about this topic. And something that was really illuminated for me was a couple of years ago, I did a group. I think it was like a 6-week group or something. I think it was 6-week group on betrayal and infidelity with the partners who had experienced the betrayal. And there was a lot of, different stories that came into the group, and their ability to start to heal by sharing their stories with each other and talking about what that betrayal was like, and not necessarily talking about what they wanted to do about it, because everybody was in like a different place, and a lot of people come when something like this happens, they're ambivalent about what could happen, what they want to do, but just the talking about it and processing through and really exploring their emotions helps them start to heal, to think about, what do I want my life to look like, without the pressure of like having to come to a decision. But Sari, for you, like, what is something about this topic that you wish you would have known earlier in your career?
So I presented on this topic quite a bit to general therapists, actually, because, what general therapists will try to do is something that we do, but we add more to it. So what a general therapist will do is help, because a lot of times there are couples who come to us right after they were the infidelity was discovered. And so they are working on repair and repairing the trust that has been broken, and maybe talking about kind of the emotional dynamics that might have contributed to it. But they'll also stress a lot on the person who strayed to respond and repair and apologize, obviously, and make amends for their crossing the agreement. But they're not going to talk and ask questions individually of each partner about their sexual history. They're not going to ask if individually, sometimes, because a lot of couples therapists don't see partners individually, whether there's any connection going on between the partner who went out and their affair or infidelity partner or partners. They're not going to ask about sexual health. They're not going to say, like, have you been tested? Were you using a condom? Were you using any sort of barrier method? Is there a chance that the person with whom, if it's a male, heterosexual male, the person with whom you had contact could possibly be pregnant? All of those sexual health questions. That's something I only gained when I became sex therapist, and what we use now all the time when we're dealing with a couple or an individual, for that matter, who have strayed, have stepped out, have crossed their sexual exclusivity contract, is what we call it, or if they're the betrayed partner, as you talked about.
Yeah. Similarly, when I do consultations with other general therapists about this topic, let's say they have a couple that's in their practice and they want to talk more about the sexual aspect of the infidelity, something that I always bring up is talking about those sexual health aspects and how to ask it, because a lot of times general therapists, not only do they not know what to ask, but how to ask it in a way that like they feel something comes up in them, right? That's their stuff coming up, and they feel like maybe they're being too invasive, or they're going to offend one of the partners if they bring this up. But it's such an important question, because if we look beyond what's just happening relationally, or in addition to relationally, right? When someone is not using a barrier method, or they don't know the sexual health status of the person that they're with, and then they're coming back and having sex with their partner unprotected and putting them at risk, what is that emotion there, or what is the decision making going in for the partner that's making that decision, right? Like, are you thinking about your partner? And then that conversation, how does that impact your partner, that, oh, well, they weren't even thinking about my sexual health and what the consequences are. And sometimes this conversation looks different from someone that has like a maybe a one-off like affair where it's something spur in the moment, or like let's say they're like out, they get drunk and something just happens, compared to like a long-term affair, or something that's a little more intentional in the thought behind it. And even just those sexual health questions that you and I as sex therapists see as like, well, this is foundational. A lot of times general therapists don't think to ask that, and then it just brings up so much deeper conversation to process and things to work through in therapy.
I agree. And the other thing I think that we have learned as sex therapists, and what we ask about in supervision, is kind of the pattern of the infidelity on the person who broke the sexual health or sexual exclusivity agreement, right? Because a lot of couples therapists will either, they might assume that the person has an addiction because of either the betrayed partner's sort of diagnosis or description of the behavior, or they won't look at it as a sexual compulsive problem, which it in very well may be, right? It actually, in groups that I've run for people with out of control sexual behavior for men, so many of them have underlying other issues, comorbid presenting issues, and they did break their agreements, right? So it's not just an infidelity case, right? You're dealing with a lot more underlying issues for each partner, including what may be an out of control sexual behavior, what we call, an out of control sexual behavior problem, what other people might call it a sex addiction or porn addiction.
And sometimes people don't know how to ask or what to ask to differentiate those things, right? When you're doing that differential diagnosis for the couple, they, sometimes take what the person is saying as like, as, oh, I have an addiction, or, I have a porn addiction, and then just take their word on it without asking more questions. Something that was really surprising to me was when that would come up in sessions and I would start asking about like someone's sexual behaviors, and it wouldn't look like compulsive behaviors. So then we get into, okay, what is it? What are your beliefs behind sexuality that's leading you to believe that this is compulsive behavior? Or like, what is your understanding of compulsive behavior? And then that also becomes something else to talk about and work through individually and as a couple. And when I was a general therapist, even my early days in working as a sex therapist, I had no idea to ask, like what to ask, to how to differentiate that. And actually, I needed additional training, right? Like I took a course by Doug Braun Harvey on out of control sexual behavior, and that really helped me be very clear on how to do that differential diagnosis with out of control sexual behavior and what people are saying when they come into the room about it.
Also, I think before I became an AASECT certified sex therapist and supervisor, I didn't feel comfortable, to be honest, asking about detailed descriptions of a couple's sex life before the infidelity was discovered. I felt kind of nervous. I didn't want to blame anyone, like the betrayed partner. I didn't want them to feel betrayed. But at the same time, like, if you don't know kind of what the quality of their sex life, if you just focus on the emotional stuff, you're going to miss some really big things, right? So if one partner has a very specific sexual interest or fetish, right, and they try to have a conversation with their partner about it, and the other partner just shut it down, or if the couple, hadn't had sex in years, like all of those things are really important. And before that, they only had sex really out of duty because of, they were in the reproductive stage of their relationship, or they went through a bout of years of infertility treatments. Like all of that stuff is important to excavate and disclose and inquire about. But if you don't feel like this is the proper time to ask about it, you're going to miss so much in your assessment on
Mm-hmm.
how to create a treatment plan that really works for both partners, with the relationship, with their sex life, what their goals are for their sex life, right? I mean, and it also doesn't, it's something that we didn't talk about in terms of infidelity in the case of consensual non-monogamy, both
Mm-hmm.
if the partners actually want to explore that, or if they're in a CNM relationship and infidelity occurred.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people that aren't familiar with CNM relationships just assume, well, you're in an open relationship, so anything goes, right? And if, there's no boundaries, but there are boundaries, and it's important to talk about that. And there can be betrayal within a CNM relationship. And so it's important to really establish, like, okay, well, this is where the betrayal came from. What does that mean for you two? And what does that mean for your CNM agreement or your relationship agreement?
But also I would say that a lot of couples therapists, general therapists, it'll the fact that an infidelity or betrayal happened, it will somehow confirm their own belief system as,
Mm-hmm.
like, you see, CNM doesn't ever work,
Mm-hmm.
which is not actually accurate.
Mm-hmm. Because it's going back to talking about, like, what is CNM, right? And how do you have that? The basis of it is really like that open and transparent conversation. And so if that's not happening, then is it really, well, we're talking about consensual or ethical, like, is it really consensual or ethical if that open and transparent conversation isn't happening? Or is it just non-monogamy, and like really processing through that? And the therapist, it's important that they're really educated on what those differences are and how that shows up in that particular relationship, because everyone has different ideas about how they want to do this. And so those internalized beliefs that the therapist has, like, it's important for that not to come through onto the couple during sessions.
Right, because it's a bias. It's like saying, if a heterosexual monogamous, previously thought of as monogamous relationship, couple come in because of infidelity, the therapist isn't going to say, you see, I told you marriage doesn't work, right? I mean, it shows inherent internalized bias that
Mhm.
therapists have to alternative sexual lifestyles and agreements. And so that's something also that that's kind of the expertise we've gained over the years, right, as therapists.
Yeah. I think for me, like, the number one thing that I wish that I had known as a couples therapist about this is the, I guess this isn't one thing, but like the knowing how, or like having the ability to hold space for all of these things to be true at one time, and really
Yeah.
having that skill set and that nuance to work through the different things that come up when talking about infidelity and affairs, right? So like, because it's not just one thing. It's not just like you're not attracted to your partner or whatever, right? Like,
Right.
there's so many things that come up.
Multiple realities. Yep.
Right. But what about for you, Sari? What's one thing that you wish you had known?
One of the things I think I wish I had known was that even bringing up, and now what? Like, if you're not interested in becoming sexual with one another again, with partners, asking that very courageous question, because I think it is. So now what do you want for each of yourselves as far as sex goes? Because a lot of, general therapists won't ask that question.
Yeah.
And the couple will remain in a sexless relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That part won't change. Maybe they'll mend the emotional, wounds and trust, but the sex, that may not return. And that's the second stage of recovery after
Mm-hmm.
infidelity. And I wish I'd known that, to ask more about that earlier on. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see
Thanks.
you next week.
Thanks.